Good evening. Welcome to tonight's Study in the Word. My name is Bruce Logan, and I just want to welcome you, those who may be joining for the first time. Just we're in our continuing study that we began over a year ago, or close to a year ago. It's Keys to Unlocking the Big Story of the Bible study that we've been doing, like I said, for about the past just about 10 months or so. And we're calling it the big story in fact, before I get into that part, I just want to also point out that we did in the first installment of our big study series, we did a study in the big story of the Old Testament. And you can go back on our YouTube channel and you can find and matter of fact, I'll put a link in the description also the way you can track to it, we did 30 lessons on the big story of the Old Testament. And basically, the big idea behind this entire study is that we're trying to demonstrate that the Bible is not just a collection of inspirational stories, but the Bible is actually telling us one big story. It has 66 books, but it's giving us one big story, one big meta narrative. And that narrative is the story of redemption. And every part is connected, and so when you understand the big story of the Bible, now when you go back to try to study, the individual parts, it'll make a whole lot more sense, and we'll be able to rightly divide or rightly interpret the scriptures once we really have that big meta narrative, that big picture in our mind. And so we did part one of the study, which we call the big story of the Old Testament. Now we've been in, this is lesson number 6 of our big story of the New Testament, on which I'm calling like part 2 of our big study series. And this will be the big story of the New Testament. And for the benefit of those who just may be catching this channel for the very first time, I would like to just welcome you. And I just wanted to give you kind of a brief overview of this, what we're doing and what this study is all about. But before I do, I want to just encourage you to, if you see anything in that, or hear anything that you might like, or you think this might be beneficial, it would be great if you would click that subscribe button, so that you would be able to, every time we go online, every time we do one of these studies, that you will be able to receive a notification, and then you'll be able to join us. And you can also reach out to me on my website, and bruceloganministries.com. And then if you like this video, I mean, click that like button. That would even help us even more, or just as much rather. And so really would appreciate it if you would consider that. And then also, I just wanted to point out again, those of you who have been, following me for a while, you know that this is Acts 17 and 11 is our trademark premise. It's the foundation of everything we try to do in this ministry, and it's actually one of my personal favorite single verses in the New Testament, because it says a lot about the character of the Bereans who Paul ministered to. And Acts 17 and 11 says, now the Berean Jews were of more noble character than those in Thessalonica, for they received the message with great eagerness, and they examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true or not. And one of the reasons why I find this particular verse of scripture so interesting, and why I like it so much, is because when you really examine it closely, you'll notice that these Berean Jews, first of all, God called them of more noble character. But then after that, you'll notice the fact that they had the apostle Paul teaching them. These Bereans were being taught by the apostle Paul himself, arguably one of the greatest theologians and Bible teachers that ever lived outside of Jesus Christ himself. But in spite of the fact that they had the apostle Paul instructing them, they still found it necessary to go back and search the scriptures for themselves to see if what the greatest teacher that ever lived outside of Jesus was telling them the truth or not. And so I say all that to point out that what I desire to do in this ministry is to create a community of Bereans, a community of people who won't take anything that I say, but they will, or at face value rather, but you will go back and you'll research. You hear what I say, use it as a tool to go back and research for yourself to see whether or not I'm really coming from the scriptures. See if whether or not I'm really saying things that are actually true and biblical. And so I want to encourage everyone to do that. I would encourage you to say, long story short, to not to take anything that I say at face value, but to search the scriptures for yourself, and be a part of this community of Bereans that we're trying to create. And so, with that said, we're going to move forward and get into our study for tonight. And we've been looking at the big story of the New Testament, and we've been studying it from six historical periods. In other words, when I talk about the big story, I'm taking it not book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse, but instead we're looking at from a, I'm calling it the 10,000 foot view and of scriptures. Like we're in a satellite and we're looking down from a 10,000 foot view, and we're seeing the big picture of the Bible. And so we're in order to demonstrate the big picture of the Bible, we're doing it through the lens, just like in the Old Testament. We did it through the lens of 11 foundational books and also through 7 periods of Israel's history. So we looked at the big picture. And again, you can go back and research. There are 30 lessons on the big story of the Old Testament. But we're taking that same concept to point out the big story of the New Testament. And we're looking at the New Testament through the lens of six historical periods that make up the New Testament. That might be a little different approach than many of you have seen. But if I feel confident that if you track with me and if you follow me and you stay with me, it'll all make sense. And when you go back and study on your own, it's going to help you to understand, the Bible. When you do your own personal studies, your understanding, I firmly believe, is going to be enhanced a great deal by just seeing, having this big picture in your mind. And so, with that being said, the six historical periods that make up the New Testament, and that we're going to be, kind of demonstrating the New Testament through this lens, are the period of preparation. Of course, this is the period that we've been on for the past 3 weeks, and we're going to continue again with tonight and probably at least one more week. And the reason being is because out of all the 6 periods, this is the period that I feel the most passionate about, that I feel is the most important, that I feel that has gone more under the radar in terms of Christianity, in terms of, in most churches, than any of the other periods. And now, hopefully, if you've been tracking with me, you'll maybe follow exactly why I've been saying that. But the period of preparation, what do we mean by that? It's the 400-year intertestamental period, or the 400-year period between Malachi and Matthew. And more, to be more specific, is the end of Malachi and the call of John the Baptist. That's that 400-year period. And a lot of Bible teachers and scholars and historians refer to this period as the silent years. And but the truth of the matter is, this 400-year period uh was anything but silent. I understand why it's called the silent years, but because God was not speaking. There was no prophet in the land during this 400-year period. God didn't give it wasn't given a prophetic word during this 400-year period. But what many people who refer to this as the silent years, what you miss is the fact that God did indeed, for two things. First of all, God did indeed speak prophetically concerning this 400-year intertestamental period. The only difference is he didn't speak during this 400-year period. He had already spoken about this 400-year period in the book of Daniel. And what God was literally doing was that he was literally preparing this world stage for the coming of the Messiah. Galatians 4:4 says, when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his son. And what God was literally doing, he was setting the stage for the fullness of time. He was supernaturally and providentially preparing the world stage, like a conductor conducting the orchestra. He was conducting world history in order to prepare the way, in order to set the stage for Jesus to be born in that manger. And one last point about that is that when Jesus was born in that manger, it was not some random or arbitrary point in time where God just, willy nilly decided, yeah, you know what, I think this was a perfect time. But it was a set time that God had preordained, that he had prepared the world stage for this specific point in time in world history. And during this 400 years was God was preparing the world stage for the coming of his son. And this is the reason why we call this four. We don't refer to it as the 400 silent years, but we refer to it as the 400-year period of preparation, because God was literally preparing the world, and hopefully we've been seeing that so far as we've been into the third part of the study. We're going to see it even more as we get into it tonight. Moving along real quickly, the second period that we're going to be examining is the we're going to be examining the second period, which is the period of expectation. The period of expectation is that period that's surrounding the life of Christ. The life of Christ is was the period that takes up the period of the four gospels, and so we refer to that the whole. In other words, when we get into that part or part two of this big story of the New Testament, we're basically just going to be examining the life of Christ through the lens. We're going to say a big picture overview of the life of Christ through the lens of the four gospels. And next, we have the period of establishment. The period of establishment is the period of the early stages or the early years of the establishment of the church that runs from Acts 1 and 1 all the way through Acts 6 and 7. Then we're going to be looking at the period of extension that runs from Acts 6 verses 8. At the death of Stephen, the church began to scatter and begin to spread and kind of grow or extend outside of the borders of Jerusalem and Samaria. And so we call this period the period of extension. And then we have the fifth period known as the period of rapid expansion. And this is the period that encompasses all of Paul's three missionary journeys. And it's during this particular period where all the Pauline epistles were written. And so because all of the establishment, all the churches that were established during this period, and so we call this period of rapid expansion because the church began to rapidly grow, rapidly expand because of the three missionary journeys of the Apostle Paul. And so we're going to examine that. We're going to take a big bird's eye view from our 10,000-foot perch and look at this period of rapid expansion. And then finally, we're going to be looking at the period of consolidation. And this period of consolidation follows the book of Acts. When Acts concludes right around 67 A.D., it was probably shortly before Paul was beheaded in Rome by Nero. And after the book of Acts concludes, one of the things that happens is the church continued to grow, but in spite of but as the church continued to grow, they needed some structure. They needed some admonition. They needed some order. They needed some more additional theology and structure and order. And they also needed a lot of encouragement because the church was going through a strong period of persecution. So all of these things were happening at once. They were dealing with persecution from within, persecution from without. They were dealing with lack of structure and order. And so it was during this period of consolidation where most of the general epistles were written. All of the general epistles, with the exception of the book of James, which we'll talk about later, which was written much earlier. But apart from the book of James, all of the general epistles, First and Second Peter, Jude, First, Second, and Third John, and so forth, were written during this period of consolidation that ran from right around 67 to 97 AD, with the last book was the book of Revelations. And so uh, with that said, moving forward, now let's getting back to our lesson. We're in the period of preparation, and we're in this will be lesson 4 in our discussion of the period of preparation. And one of the things I wanted to point out about this period of preparation is that there were 6 key events or that occurred during this particular period, and we're just going to run through them real quickly. And there was the Persian period, the Greek period, which we're going to highlight tonight. There was where the period of the Septuagint, and this is going to be important. And as a matter of fact, when you study a lot of Bible scholars, and I've noticed this to be the case even in some Bible software programs, that the number 2 and number 3 and number 4 is all lumped in into one period as the Greek period. But I like to separate it because it kind of this separation, as you'll see as we go along, it kind of helps us to have clarity of exactly to what God was actually doing during this period. Then you had the Maccabean revolt, which is technically part of the Greek period also, but it was all coming to a culmination. And then also you had the Hasmonean period, which was also on the tail end of the Greek period. And but then you had the Roman rule, and all of this is going to make sense as we unpack each one of these, and you'll see exactly what I mean. But these were separate and distinct periods overall, and even though period this, 2, 3, 4, and 5 were all technically part of the beginning and the end of the Greek period, because the Hasmonean period, period number 5, it was at the end. It kind of like bridged between the end of the Greek period, or the end of the period of Hellenism, and the beginning of Roman rule. Kind of was the gap was bridged right in there. As a matter of fact, it was because of the Hasmonean period that gave rise to the Roman period. It opened the door for the Romans to step in, and so we'll see that. But the point, reason why this is important, because when we open the New Testament, we begin to see the Gospels. We'll understand exactly what is going on. So it's just to kind of give you an example. When the Old Testament concludes, when the book of Malachi concludes, the Jews had returned back from Babylonian exile by uh, by Cyrus the Great of Persia, wrote a decree, allowed the people to return. They rebuilt their temple, they rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. They had returned. There was a revival under Ezra, and where the word of God was being preached. Because you got to remember, this was a whole separate generation of individuals that returned from Babylon than those who actually entered Babylon originally. So that's important, because there was a 70-year gap. So they returned from Babylon, and everything's they're relearning Hebrew, they're relearning their customs, and so on and so forth. And then when you fast forward to 400 years to the opening of the New Testament, everything was different. There was, there was, it was completely unrecognizable from the time that the book of Malachi concludes. So, what do I mean by that? First of all, you had this group of people called the Roman, this empire called the Romans, who were now dominating the Palestine area. And not only was there, you had the Romans dominating the area, but all the language of the day was not Hebrew but Greek. Now, almost everybody understood or spoke some manner or version of Greek. It was called Koine Greek, or the Common Greek. And then you also had all of these groups, and you had the Pharisees and Sadducees and the scribe. Where did they come from? How do all of these people come into being? And then you had all these individuals, Pontius Pilate. You hear names, you'll read names about Herod, and so forth, Caesar Augustus. So what all of the whole landscape, the whole world changed over this 400-year period that set the stage for the New Testament period. And by understanding and having a big picture overview in your mind as you of all of this period and everything that took place during this 400 years, once you get into the study of the scriptures, then it's all going to, or the study rather of the New Testament, it's going to make so much more sense as we begin to unpack the life of Christ and the Gospels and so forth. So I just wanted to and that's sort of a very, very quick synopsis of this period and why I feel like it's important. And I could go on, and as I get further into it, you'll see some things. Now look, we're getting back to the period of preparation. Up until now, in the past couple lessons, what we did is that we showed, we talked about Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7. And in Daniel chapter 2, we talked about the image that Nebuchadnezzar saw, that Daniel interpreted. Then also in Daniel chapter 7, we also saw of Daniel receiving a vision of four beasts, and the description of these four beasts is identical to the description to the various parts of the statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw. So what was God doing? God was demonstrating he gave Daniel a series of or let me put it a better way, a panoramic view. In the book of Daniel, we receive a panoramic view of world history from the Babylonian Empire all the way to the return of Christ. And so it's interesting because when you ask people just randomly, what do you think of when you think of the book of Daniel? And most people will automatically say the standard thing that we've learned back in Sunday school. We'll talk about Daniel in the lion's den, the three Hebrew boys in the fiery furnace, the handwriting on the wall, and so forth. But Daniel was literally one of the most important, at least in my opinion, one of the most important books in scripture outside of the book of Genesis, because Daniel gives a panoramic view of all of world history, um, from the Babylonian Empire all the way to the return of Christ, as we said already. And then also what's introduced here in these prophecies in the book of Daniel is a principle that we talked about earlier, known as the principle or the law of uh, progressive revelation. I had a brain freeze there for a minute. We would call it progressive revelation. In other words, as God gives these various prophecies and through the various imagery, what He's literally doing is He's progressively revealing additional details of the four major world empires that impacted the Middle East during this 400-year period. He's given but each succession of visions that Daniel receives all relate to one of these four empires, but each one gives additional details that the previous vision didn't receive. So as God goes on through Daniel 8, Daniel 9, Daniel 11, we'll get additional information, additional details. And so God will progressively reveal different aspects of these four world empires as time goes, as each prophecy or each successive prophecy, I should say, is given here in the book of Daniel. So in other words, so we got the Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, and the Roman Empire, and different imagery was used in Daniel 2 and then also in Daniel 7, but it's all referring to the same four empires. Now we're moving forward to Daniel chapter 8. And I just want to spend a lesson, one class here on Daniel 8, because so much encompasses. If you recall, we're going to be looking at Daniel 8 and Alexander the Great and his conquest and the rise of Hellenism. And why do I say that this is so important? If you recall back to the earlier graphic where I demonstrated those the historical periods that make up the 400-year intertestamental period, that over half of it, notice I pointed out that, the various aspects, the rise of the Septuagint and so forth, the rise of Hellenism was all part of the various periods. All of that was due to the exploits of this young man by the name of Alexander the Great. And so we're going to be looking at and I honestly believe that this passage that Daniel chapter 8 is one of the most incredible prophecies in all of scripture because of the level of precision in which everything was fulfilled. And what's amazing about this Daniel chapter 8 is that, in fact, it carries over into Daniel chapter 11, as we'll touch on here maybe next week, and we can conclude this. Hopefully, I'll conclude this period of preparation next week. However, one of the things that's so amazing is that even Bible skeptics and people or even or atheists and people who don't believe in the Bible at all, the only way that they can explain away Daniel chapter 8 is to say, and also Daniel 11, by the way, and we'll see that as well. But they say that the only explanation that they possibly can come up with is that it had to have been written, or the book of Daniel or these prophecies in Daniel had to have been written after the fact, because no other possible explanation can be given in their minds anyway as to why or how anyone could have given these prophecies hundreds of years ahead of time with such precision. They just they believe it's not humanly possible. But what they don't understand is that we serve a God who said, I can see the end from the beginning. We serve a God who can see the end from the beginning, or in other words, he's actually in a existing within a dimension that is outside of our human comprehension of space and time. And you've heard me talk about that, if you've been following me. Is that, in other words, to kind of summarize it, he can see the past, he's able to see the future and the present all at the same time. Okay. And because he's not confined to our comprehension of time and space, but he's outside of time. So, and just go back and read Isaiah 46 and 10, and you'll kind of get a glimpse of what we're saying. But one of the things that's amazing about this, that if you look at this passage that we're going to be looking at in the fulfillment of prophecy that we're going to be examining here in Daniel chapter 8, but the fulfillment of prophecy as recorded by historians that powerfully demonstrate the power of Bible prophecy. In other words, as we're going to be unpacking the exploits of Alexander the Great, and of course, we're not going to be able to do a complete study. The internet is full of historical documentaries. The History Channel has a great one, on one of my favorite ones, on the life of Alexander the Great and his exploits. But what's amazing is that the Daniel chapter 8 and also Daniel chapter 11 literally outlines, and of course this was over 200 years before Alexander was even born. And so this is just incredibly amazing. And so with that being said, let's just look at a little bit. We're going to examine Daniel chapter 8. And I'm going to go through this real fast because it's just so much. This is actually one of my, as far as like historical, or I should say, historical characters that I like to study. There's no Alexander is like at the top of the list because of the things that he accomplished in his lifetime. And what was so amazing is that he died. He was only 32 years old when he died, and so he accomplished everything that's we're going to talk about here in Daniel chapter 8 was accomplished in under 10 years. And so even if you recall the image of the Greek Empire as a leopard, remember I talked about that last week, that the image in Daniel chapter 7 was a leopard with four heads and four wings on its back. And so you can imagine a leopard just in general is super fast, one of the fastest land animals on earth. And if you add that to the fact that that you add four wings on its back, that's indicating a tremendous amount of speed. And you're going to see that when Alexander conquered the entire Persian Empire in under 10 years, and it was every time in every confrontation he had with the Persian, he was always grossly outnumbered, sometimes two, three, and some theologians say even some historians rather say even 4 or 5 to 1. So just it was just an amazing part of world history, and it literally had a direct impact on the New Testament world when Jesus came. And so I don't want to get ahead of myself, but let's look at Daniel chapter 8 and verses 1 and 2. We're going to look at verses 1 through 8. Then we're going to look at verses 15 through 22. So in other words, we're going to see the vision, and then we're going to be given the interpretation in verses 15 through 22. So in the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me. Of course, this is Daniel speaking. After the one that appeared to me the first time, I saw in the vision, and it so happened while I was looking that I was in Shushan, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision that I was by the river Ulai. Then I lifted up my eyes and saw that there was standing beside the river was a ram which had two horns. The ram which had two horns, keep that in mind. And the two horns were high, but one was higher than the other. And the higher one came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, southward, and so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. Now, notice verse 5. And as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. Now, notice that came across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. And note in your mind as you're reading this denote that the leopard that had four wings on his back, which means talking about that it was a reference to a tremendous amount of speed in which this male goat was going to conquer, right? And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes, all right? The goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Then he came to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. In other words, the goat ran at the ram with furious power. And I saw him confronting the ram. That's the goat. He saw the goat confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him, against the ram, attacked the ram, and broke his two horns. There was no power in the ram to withstand him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled him. And there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. Now, before I go on and read verse 8, I wanted to point out you got to keep in mind and the big picture of this narrative as we begin to preach, because we obviously going to see who this is all about, but we're also going to learn that or I want you to be able to see rather that how all of the significance of what we're about to read and what those roles played during this 400-year period, during the period that we outlined at the beginning, as in when it came to establishing or preparing the world stage for the opening of the New Testament. Okay, this is what you got to keep in mind. You got to make sure as we're reading this, we're not just reading words on the page, but we're seeing prophecies that literally were given hundreds of years prior that happened precisely as God said, and that had a direct impact and influence on the world, the geographical, the political culture, the religious culture of the New Testament when Jesus was born. So this is the reason why as we're reading this, you got to be able to make that connection. It's very, very, very important. That's why I wanted to pause and just kind of re-emphasize that. Now, verse 8, therefore the male goat grew very great. But when he had became strong, the large horn was broken, and in the place of it, four notable ones came up toward the four winds of heaven. So significant. This is one of the most significant verses this verse happened exactly that. In other words, this the large horn was, of course, as we've already kind of given it away, was Alexander the Great, and he conquered the entirety of the Persian Empire, and he did it in less than 10 years. He was 20 years old when he was given command of the Greek forces after his father Philip of Macedon had been assassinated. Uh, Alexander was made king, and he went on to conquer the Persian Empire in less than 10 years. And when he died suddenly at the age of 32, I think a month before his 33rd birthday, there was a war that took place between his four top generals. His four top generals fought to see who would control the empire. And of course, I'm getting way ahead of myself. So let me just go on. And verse 9 said, and notice what it says. At verse 8, and out of first you're going to have these four horns that's going to prop up, and out of one of them came a little horn. In other words, out of one of the four successors for Alexander's empire is going to come another horn. And we're going to talk about this other horn more so when we get to chapter 11, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. The glorious land, anytime you see that scripture, it's obviously talking about Jerusalem. Now, we fast forward to verse 15. Gabriel himself gives Daniel the interpretation of the vision. This is amazing. Okay, because he's actually going to get the interpretation of this vision from Gabriel himself. So now, then it happened when I, Daniel, had seen the vision and was seeking the meaning, that suddenly there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Uli, who called and said, Gabriel, Make this man understand the vision. Verse 17. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell upon my face. But he said unto me, understand, O Son of Man, for at the time of the end shall the vision be. Now, as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep on my face toward the ground, but he touched me and set me upright. And he said, behold, I will make you to know what shall be in the last and it or the last of the indignation, for at the time appointed the end shall be. Now, get this. This is going to be important. The ram which you saw, which I've kind of already given it away, which you saw having the two horns, they are the kings of the Medes and the Persians. And note with note of the two horns. They were the kings of the Medes and the Persians. Persians, it was actually the Persian Empire who they actually took over under Cyrus the Great, the Persian Empire. But instead of conquering them, he incorporated the Median Empire into the Persian. They just basically became uh, one empire, but they allowed the Medes to maintain their own identity, even though they were technically one empire. Um, so in verse 21, and the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. Of course, the large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. And of course, we're talking about Alexander the Great. As for the broken horn and the four that stood up in its place, four kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its own power. In other words, when Alexander died, his four top generals were Seleucus, Ptolemy, Lysimachus, and Cassander were his four top generals, and a couple of them actually were his friends that he grew up with from his childhood. They fought actually. They were great friends until after Alexander died. Then they ended up fighting each other for control of the empire. And to make a long story short, they after all the dust had settled, it was these four generals actually carved out certain aspects of the empire for themselves. And when that was all done, once we get into chapter 11, there's going to be two of those empires that's going to stand out above the other four, and that's going to be the Seleucus and Ptolemy, which in Daniel chapter 11 they're referred to as the kings of the north and the kings of the south. And so we're going to talk more about that when we get to it. So now let's look a little bit about talk a little bit rather about Alexander. Alexander, and I'm just going to try to hit as much of this I can tonight, and then we're going to just move forward to chapter 11 next week, and then we're going to be kind of put a bow on this period of preparation. But okay, Alexander, let's look at it. Alexander is widely considered one of history's greatest military tactical geniuses, primarily because he never lost a battle during his military career. And that's one of the things that's just so incredible, that not only did he conquer the entire Persian Empire within under 10 years, but he was undefeated in all the battles that he had with the Persians. Now just let that sink in for a moment. He was undefeated, never lost a single battle, which is just something that even some of the greatest military commanders in history all lost battles. But Alexander never lost a battle. Alexander the Great became king at the young age of 20, and in just 13 years, he amassed the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen. And now it said 13 years because he died just shortly before his 33rd birthday. But before he died, he had already conquered the Persian Empire by the time he was within less than 10 years. But then he wanted more land to conquer. So he conquered all the way into Egypt I'm sorry, not Egypt, but India rather, after he had already conquered the entirety of the Persian Empire. And keep in mind that the Persian Empire was the numerically largest empire that the world had ever seen up until that time. And Alexander's forces, and he was undefeated, but his forces were always outnumbered 2 to 3 to 1, sometimes more. And against overwhelming odds, Alexander led his army to victories across the Persian territories as Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, without suffering a single defeat. Alexander always led by example, although his belief in his own indestructibility meant that he was often reckless with his own life and those of his soldiers. I mean, there are a lot of stories. I won't go into to any of those right now, but there are a lot of stories where Alexander would just recklessly just be leading and go sometimes even without any backup into a battle, and God would he was spared in every single time. He received a lot of wounds, but he was never killed. And then when he died, as a matter of fact, as we'll see, that the circumstances of his death still remain a mystery here, like over 2,000 years later. His greatest victory, of course, was the Battle of Gaugamela in what is now northern Iraq in 331 BC, and he became king of all of Persia at the age of 25. Now, let that sink in. He became king of all of Persia at the age of 25. And so technically the initial part of the campaign was only 5 years, where he conquered the largest empire that ever lived without a single defeat. But then there was other, reason why we say it was under 10 years, because there were other parts of the Persian Empire who still, was trying to hold out, that was toward the east of the Babylonian area, where Alexander eventually would go root out, and he conquered all of those as well. But after conquering the Persian Empire, he was planning even more campaigns when he suddenly and mysteriously died in 323 BC. Alexander had not ironed out all of the details of how the empire was to be run, nor had he appointed a successor. Of course, he didn't have any children. He had a wife who was not a full blood Greek, but she was pregnant at the time. And so they kind of wanted to figure out, well, by rights, maybe the child would be, would be able to take over, but he would be too young. Of course, somebody would have to like be his mentor until he was old enough to conquer or to take over the empire and so forth. But anyway, that's just kind of the subplot of the story. But he had empowered many of his childhood friends who grew up with him to hold the highest offices in the empire. In other words, we talked about many of his childhood friends, and once he conquered, they all his boys, he gave them positions. But then they all turned on each other after Alexander died, and they fought for the control of the empire. These friends would later go to war against each other for control of Alexander's empire. And what's amazing is that Alexander was so gifted, so anointed, so charismatic, that even all of his friends, so many of them were great generals in their own right, but they did not have the acumen in order to lead and control that Alexander had at his young age. And so they end up fighting over it, and those fights end up leading to to the establishment of many of the things that we're going to learn as we get into the New Testament. So uh, it is the growth of Hellenism and so forth was all part of it. Though his career was brief, he left one of the greatest legacies of any ruler in history, in large part because of the blending of cultures that became the Hellenistic world. And so when you open up the New Testament and you hear the word Hellenist, Hellenistic, that's all a direct result of the exploits of Alexander. Um, so also, by the way, many, what was so amazing about the spread of the Hellenism just simply means the spread of Greek culture, the spread of Greek language, Greek religion, Greek architecture. That's what we mean when we see the term Hellenism or Hellenistic in the New Testament. It's referring to all things Greek, Greek language, the Koine Greek, Greek architecture, Greek religion, and so forth. And this was the world that Christ was born into. And not only that, the Romans eventually would conquer all the Greeks, the separate the groupings of land that was grouped by Alexander's four generals. The Roman would eventually conquer each one by one, and the last one, of course, would be the empire or the Ptolemies, who was they were under the control of Cleopatra. And of course, yeah, I'm talking about that Cleopatra, Liz Taylor Cleopatra. And so that was how the end of the Greeks, all of the Greeks and everything became all Roman after that. So now, Alexander's legacy was quickly made, briefly lived, and he was lasted to the, has lasted to this day. Born in 356 BC and dying 32 years later, he only reigned for 13 years. His legendary conquest of nearly the entire known world resulted in one of the largest empires in ancient history. Alexander overthrew the entire Persian Empire, as we already talked about, and he died undefeated in battle, but without a clear heir, which led to the division of his empire. Now, if you notice this map here is kind of give you put it into perspective. So Alexander, he comes from over here in Macedonia, which is part of northern Greece. He they actually conquers all of Greece, and then he begins to travel, and he had several primary battles, and he eventually won every one of these every battle that he ever fought, and he carved out everything you see in green as became the part of the Babylonian, I'm sorry, part of the Greek Empire. And of course, here's a listing. I just put up here a listing of some of his major battles that he's more famous for. And we won't go through all of these, but just the Battle of the Granicus, the Siege of Tyre, the Battle of Issus, the Battle of Gaugamela, and the Battle of the Habastus, which is, by the way, was when he had already conquered the Babylonians. I'm sorry, the all of the Persian Empire at the Battle of Gaugamela. He went on later to travel into India, and he conquered a part of that as well. And one of the amazing things about Alexander, this is showing you also how God was working during this period, and it's really not accurate to call this period the silent years, because even when we didn't realize that, God was still working. When Alexander was just a young boy, just a young teenager, as a matter of fact, his father hired Aristotle in order to tutor his son Alexander, because he saw some special things in his son. He hired Aristotle, who is arguably one of, well, back then was the greatest philosopher of that time, and then he taught Alexander, and it was through and it was because of what he Alexander learned from Aristotle that would actually help um, promote Hellenism and the Greek language and the Greek culture. Now, Aristotle, of course, significantly influenced the development of Koine Greek, and of course, Koine Greek became the prominent. And you can see, if you're tracking with me, you can see how all of this kind of connects, how all the dots are coming together, all the puzzle pieces in this 400-year time frame, prior to the or during these 400 years between the testaments. You can see how God was literally, supernaturally, and providentially putting puzzle pieces in place in order to set the world stage. So nothing was happening by accident. Nothing was random. Nothing was arbitrary. But God was, you can see that God was literally working. So Aristotle significantly influenced the development of Koine Greek by formalizing the technical philosophical vocabulary and structure, syntax, that became essential to Hellenistic thought. And of course, it was as the results of the Koine Greek that Aristotle developed, which became the common language of the New Testament, and it was spread because of the exploits of Alexander. His works established, for example, key Greek terminology for logic and ethics, which continued to influence philosophical language for centuries. Aristotle established the intellectual foundation and vocabulary to help define the sophisticated philosophical end of the Koine spectrum. Tutoring Alexander the Great by educating Alexander, Aristotle's language and ideas indirectly influenced cultural shift that spread Greek as a lingua franca after Alexander's conquest. And so you can see once again that God was not silent during this 400 years, but he was actually working through history. And a little bit more about Alexander. And this is the part, and I was rushing because I wanted to get to this part, because I find this fascinating. And I find this is the go-to whenever you have people that want to argue with you and claim that Alexander or the book of Daniel had to have been written after the fact. Then of course you tell them about this story, which of course this quiets that noise down immediately. Because here, notice the something that happened, very, I think they're just very providential, as Alexander was heading to down toward Egypt. and he was going through Palestine, and he visits Jerusalem during this journey. And we're told the story by the historian named Josephus. And when Jadis, the high priest, and this is of course just excerpts from Josephus, understood that Alexander was not far from the city, he went out in procession with the priests and the multitude of citizens. Now, of course, Jadis was the high priest at the time, so he hears that Alexander was coming, and so he goes out to meet him. And after literally throwing open the doors of Jerusalem and taking pains to be as friendly as and non-threatening as possible, Jadis, the high priest, and a large column of prominent citizens went out to meet the army of Alexander. Once again, this is Josephus. This is a direct quote from the writings of Josephus. When Alexander sees Jadis dressed in the robes of the high priest and in a turban adorned with a gold plate engraved with the Hebrew name of God, Yahweh, he approached him and first saluted the high priest. They approached him by himself and saluted the high priest. This Alexander did this. In explanation, because when he did this, his men and some of his soldiers around him thought he was like had lost his mind. Why are you doing this? Because you're Alexander. What are you doing? Saluting, what are you saluting this man? You're Alexander. So, but in explanation, Alexander said that he had seen this high priest in a dream before embarking on his campaign of conquest. Further, in his dream, the high priest had assured Alexander that he would be victorious over the Persians. And when he had given the high priest his right hand, the priest ran along by him, and he came into the city, came into Jerusalem. Now, according to the first century historian Josephus, the Jerusalem high priest Jadua showed Alexander the Great the book of Daniel. And when shown the prophecy in Daniel, Alexander believed he was the Greek designated to destroy the Persian Empire. And of course, that turned out to be 100% true. And Alexander is taken into Jerusalem, where he offers a sacrifice to God at the temple, according to the high priest's direction. While in the city, a scroll was brought to Alexander, and when the book of Daniel was shown him, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, he supposed that himself was that person indeed. And as he was then glad, he dismissed and the multitude for the present. The next day he called them to him and bid them, this of course, him, Alexander, and asked what favors they pleased of him. Whereupon the high priest desired that they might enjoy the laws of their forefathers and might pay no tribute on the seventh year. He granted all they desired. And when they entreated him that he would permit the Jews in Babylon and Media to enjoy their own laws also, he willingly promised to do hereafter what they desired. And of course, you notice it says here that there were Jews that were still in Babylon and Media. And of course, this is referencing to the many of the Jews who, and after the original Babylonian 70-year captivity, when Cyrus signed a decree permitting, allowing them to return to their homeland, only a small fraction of the population actually returned back to Jerusalem. The rest had carved out, significant livelihoods for themselves, and they decided, why move? We got it going on here, so they stayed. They stayed in Babylon. So there was always a community of Jews in Babylon. So, and when he said to the multitude that if any of them would enlist themselves in his army, on this condition that they should continue under the laws of their forefathers and live according to them. He was willing to take them with him. Many were ready to accompany him in his wars. And so some of the Jewish soldiers and Jewish men actually accompanied Alexander in his further conquests. Now, let's look at the division of Alexander's empire after Alexander died. And remember in verse 22, as for the broken horn, the four that stood up in its place, four kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but with not with its power. In other words, not with the power of Alexander. So Alexander dies at the age of 32. His empire is divided amongst his four top generals, and of course, as we can see, this prophecy was given and it was fulfilled Exactly. And this is what's amazing. Now you gotta let this sink in, because this prophecy was in Daniel chapter 8 was given 200 years before Alexander was even born. So you keep this in perspective and see how God was working, how what God said in his word is going to come to pass. That's one of the things we have to get out of this. And so, and just to put a pin right there, if everything that happened previously, because we have the vantage point looking back in history and seeing everything was fulfilled precisely as God had said here in Daniel chapter 8. And if God is operating, and if God is fulfilling his word with that level of precision, or for prophecy that's already been fulfilled, just think about the prophecies yet to be remaining. Because when Jesus ascended back into heaven, God said, or there were angels that stood by and said, "Why, ye men of Galilee, why are ye standing here gazing up into heaven?" The same Jesus that you see going up into heaven is going to come back in like manner as you see him go up into heaven. So in other words, just as just as the stage was set to for the fullness of time when Jesus was or the perfect time for Jesus to be born in that manger, in the same way the world stage right now is being prepared for the coming of the Lord, which is going to be, first of all, the establishment of the Antichrist kingdom and the coming of the Lord, which is a separate lesson all in of itself. And so I'm not going to elaborate too much on that. But again, so Daniel 8 and 22, four of Alexander's generals served with Alexander will replace him, although they will not have the same power or influence that he had, because actually very few people in history had the same power and influence and anointing that Alexander had. So um, these four generals that fought for control were Cassander, Lysimachus, and of course Ptolemy. Ptolemy had Egypt, and they eventually, after all the dust settled, they conquered. They carved out certain territories for themselves, and of course Ptolemy and Seleucus, of course, were the most prominent because they had the largest territory, the most influential territories. Ptolemy, of course, had Egypt, and of course the Cleopatra that we mentioned earlier was a descendant of Ptolemy. She was the last, actually the last of the Ptolemaic line. And of course Seleucus had the areas of Iran, Iraq, Syria, and so forth. And so he probably, as far as geographically, he had the largest territory. And the Seleucids would eventually, and the Ptolemies would eventually continue to change hands in terms of dominance, because they would fight against each other, or not, or their descendants. Of course, so when you see this, as we get into Daniel chapter 11, and you'll see the king of the north and the king of the south came against it, or the king of the south came against the king of the north, and vice versa. But each one of those occurrences, a generation probably have gone past, but they're talking about the line of Seleucus and the line of Ptolemy. So, but if each successive king under that dynasty, or the Seleucid dynasty or the Ptolemaic dynasty, was all referred to as the king of the north and king of the south. And when we look at Daniel 11, we'll kind of like see that clearly. And of course, you can see here in this map how all the four that we talked about, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Lysimachus, and Cassander, all, were the territories that were divided up. And of course, you can see also from this map that Seleucus and Ptolemy had the largest divisions, or the largest territories. But also, one of the things that you'll notice that right here, and where I'm pointing my pointer, is where Jerusalem was. And so, in order for the Ptolemies, or the Seleucids to face each other, they had to have control of this area of Jerusalem, which is, of course, where we're going to get into the next several period. The Maccabean period is going to come into play, as you're going to see why that occurred. Okay, and so of course the book of Daniel chapter 8 talks about a little horn. So out of the Seleucus Empire, it's going to grow up another horn. His name is Antiochus Epiphanes, and of course he was another figure that happened exactly as described in history, and he was responsible for the next period that we looked at in our original period in the in the period of the period of preparation. We had it divided up into separate periods over that 400 years, and one of those periods was the Maccabean revolt. And the Maccabean revolt is a direct result of this individual named Antiochus Epiphanes. And I'm going to pause this tonight's study right here, because we're going to get into more of Antiochus when we get into Daniel chapter 11. But I will say this, is that you have to keep one thing in mind, is that earlier I mentioned about the progressive revelation of scripture, or these prophecies being a progressive revelation. So in other words, we leave off here in Daniel chapter 8 with a description of the division of Alexander's empire, and out of one of these a little horn is going to grow up. So we know back from history that the Antiochus was a Seleucid, and we're going to study the things that he did. He desecrated the temple. He caused the abomination of the abomination of desolation. And of course, this exact same thing is referenced by Jesus Christ himself in the Olivet Discourse, and we'll look at that again next week. And Olivet Discourse was in Matthew chapter 24. But also we're going to think one of the things we're going to learn here about Antiochus, who was a descendant of the Seleucid Empire, because it says, out of one of these shall rise another little horn, which of course we can look back in history. We know for a fact historically that it was Antiochus the Fourth. And one of the things that's significant about Antiochus the Fourth is because we're gonna be introduced of another biblical principle, or theological principle known as the law of double reference. In other words, there's particular prophecies or individuals or characters that have a meaning or interpretation in the immediate, but also has within the confines of that same individual or that same prophecy, where there's a larger or bigger picture, or larger meaning, or a larger interpretation. And that's where we get the term the law of double references. Because in other words, it has a right now interpretation, but then it's going to have a later future, much broader interpretation. We'll once we get to that, I'm going to stop right here, and we're going to see that once we get into the more in Daniel chapter 11. So we're going to stop here tonight. We're going to call it a night, and we want to thank everyone who's with us again. Minister Joan, Minister Nicole, we appreciate you joining us tonight. And again, we're going to be picking this up again next Monday. And of course, I want to apologize because I've had to miss a couple weeks because I had some unexpected things. I was intended to be much further along in this study than I am right now. So I'm probably going to have to pick the pace up here a little bit. And of course, you probably noticed that because I was pointing out things kind of fast, much faster than I intended. But we're gonna pick it up. We're gonna dive into Daniel chapter 11 next week, and in Daniel chapter 11, and we're gonna try to conclude. Well, I may end up having to take 2 weeks, another 2 weeks on this period of preparation, because my instinct is wanting to be kind of move forward. But then again, as I think about it, it's kind of tough because I want to. I feel so strongly about how important this period is that we understand as believers, and how important it is for us to understand the things that happen in this period, how they impact when we open up the pages of the New Testament. Because if you when you open up the pages of the New Testament without having this background, without having these points of reference, then a lot of things that we read in the New Testament just doesn't make sense. But once you have this point of reference, when you begin to read who was Pontius Pilate, who are these different regions, who are these individuals, who are the scribes, who are the Pharisees, then when you have this point of reference already in your head, then it makes once we get more into the New Testament, or when you begin to study the Gospels, for example, in particular, you'll see how important it is, that or how much understanding this big picture, understanding these events of this 400-year period, or this period of preparation, how it's going to help us to understand the New Testament so much better. So with that being said, I'm going to get out of here. Hope and pray that you all have a good week coming. Look forward to seeing everybody next week, and hopefully I'll be able to find my pointer, and 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 so I can kind of close out tonight. And my pointer got lost. And where is my pointer? Okay. Oh, here we go. All righty then. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. I don't know. I don't know what happened right there, but God bless you. I don't know. I had a little technical snafu real quick there. But yeah, also God bless you. I'll see you all next week. Appreciate you, Minister Joan. You're such a blessing. Appreciate everything. Appreciate all your support, and Minister Nicole likewise. And I'll see you all next week. God bless.